right, so topic 8, lesson 2, ancient Egypt and Kush. So Egypt was home to one of the world's first great civilizations, and they made great achievements in writing, architecture, and various fields of science. More than 7,000 years ago, people began growing grains in the Nile River Valley. So the waters of the Nile and the fertile soil left behind by the yearly Nile floods would allow for crops to grow in Egypt's arid climate. So even though it's pretty dry and pretty sandy, because of the fertile land around the Nile River, they were able to grow stuff. So the Egyptian farmers started to build these walls around the fields to trap the Nile's floodwaters, and as it would hold those floodwaters, it would allow it to grow other things. So the water would soak into the soil and allow grains to grow. And then as this started becoming more of a common thing, the farmers could produce a food surplus. Remember, we talked about that last chapter, where the family would be growing more than they actually needed, so to have the surplus. And so eventually, over time, powerful people and families started gaining control over the region, these regions in Egypt where they were growing all the wheat and other crops. And so they began to collect some of the surplus crops as taxes. So they would get, the people would get taxed, they had to pay for their taxes with surpluses of food, so the rulers would use the tax crops to buy lots of riches of, cloth, jewelry, and other luxury items that the merchants would sell, or the merchants and the artisans. So they had these people who became full-time merchants and artists and artisans rather than being farmers. So the artisans and merchants began to settle around the home of the local rulers because they had a place to sell their stuff. And these settlements started to grow into cities that became centers of culture and power. So it was really an interesting process of how these cities came to be. So during the 3000s BC, two kingdoms developed in Egypt, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. So according to legend, there was a king named Narmer, Narmer, and he was said to have united the two kingdoms. And by uniting those two kingdoms, he became the first pharaoh of a united Egypt. Pharaoh's like a king. And so he also founded Egypt's earliest dynasty, and a dynasty is like a ruling family, whatever the ruling family is in charge at the time. So historians divide up Egypt's history into periods based on kingdoms and dynasties, right? How their history went. So a kingdom was considered a period where Egypt was unified and they weren't fighting each other. And a series of dynasties might rule during each kingdom. So I'm going to tell you some kingdoms and the dates. The dates aren't important, but just to kind of give you a reference of time. Okay, so over its history, Egypt had 3 unified kingdoms. Each lasted hundreds of years. And in between, they'd have a series of time of warfare and civil wars and division. So the first stable kingdom was called the Old Kingdom, and it was about 2686 BCE to 2181 BCE, roughly 400 or 500 years, right? Then there's a period of civil wars. Then you have the Middle Kingdom, lasting from 2025 BC to about 1700 BCE, again, 300 or so years. And then after another time of war, again, civil wars and other things, they had the New Kingdom, and that was that arose about 1550 BCE. So the New Kingdom was Egypt's richest and most powerful kingdom. And in these kingdoms, you'd have the pharaoh, who was like the king or the leader, and they relied on what you called a bureaucracy, which a bureaucracy is a system of many government officials who carry out government rules. And heading the bureaucracy was an official called the vizier, Vizier. So to control Egypt, the pharaoh needed the loyalty and labor of the people, right? So to do work in the government, but work in the fields and build things. So Egypt's society was supported by many farmers, servants, slaves, all these different people who would work together for that one goal. But the people who did the most work had the lowest status. So Egyptian society, again, was led by the pharaoh, and the Egyptians believed that the gods controlled everything. And since the pharaoh controlled Egypt, they kind of considered him as a god king who deserved the loyalty and respect of a god. Most people of ancient Egypt were farmers, though. So when they weren't, growing the food for Egypt, a lot of them worked as laborers, building things like the pyramids and other projects. And most did so willingly. They thought at one time that they were slaves building the pyramids, but now historians have kind of come to believe that it was people who were working there by choice. A lot of them believe that if they did that and they helped their god king, they'd be rewarded in the afterlife or after death. but there were still slaves in society, and they were the very bottom of society. Ancient Egyptians were polytheistic. You've heard that before. So they had worshipped many gods. And the Egyptians believed that life on earth could lead to an afterlife, or like a life after death. But that required preparation by living a good life, kind of like our morals are today. The second way the Egyptians prepared for the afterlife was by having their bodies preserved, so mummified in a lot of cases. The wealthy Egyptians would have their bodies made into mummies, so they'd be preserved and they would not decompose. But because of the mummies, the scientists today have been able to study and learn a lot about life and death in ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians are also known for their hieroglyphics. So they developed that early form of writing. It's like drawing of symbols and pictures that stand for words, ideas, sounds. And they would write these things on with ink on papyrus, which is like a paper-like material. And with writing, the Egyptians were able to share and preserve their knowledge and pass it on to generations. And this ability made Egypt's complex society and advanced technology possible. The Egyptians also created temples for their gods and tombs for their pharaohs. So the tombs would have been the underground chambers of the pyramids in most cases. And building the pyramids, it required a lot of labor, right? I mean, they're huge, they're perfectly mathematically made. The workers would cut and place those huge stones by hand, and it required the labor of thousands and thousands of people. The great age of pyramid building, though, ended about 2200 BCE. Pharaohs who ruled after that time started carving out or having carved out massive tombs like on the cliffs and the edge of the Nile Valley. So science and math were very important to the Egyptians, and they built a very solid understanding of mathematics. So their ability to construct those huge, amazing pyramids just kind of shows you how great they were at arithmetic and geometry, and their knowledge of like engineering to get them, built so perfectly. No other civilizations have been able to plan and build such perfectly shaped structures. And they also developed those complex systems of irrigation with the Nile River. They also made huge advancements in science and astronomy, and their astronomy would help them plan their growing season of what crops to grow when, and they developed a calendar similar to the one we use today. All right, so through trade, the Egyptians came into contact with the Kush people, Kush, and it was a land up the Nile to the south. And they were rich in resources, including gold. So to gain control of these riches, Egypt conquered most of the area of the Kush during the Middle and New Kingdoms. And they conquered these Kushites, and then they made them pay tribute to the pharaoh. A tribute is a payment from the conquered people to the person in charge or the more powerful country. And when Egypt weakened, the New Kingdom ended, and then Kush went back to being an independent kingdom and ruled by their own Kushite king. In the mid-700s BCE, a Kushite king conquered the Egyptian city of Thebes, Thebes. And so the next ruler of Kush conquered the rest of Egypt, so it's kind of a back and forth. So pharaohs from Kush then ruled Egypt for almost 100 years. Kush remained an advanced civilization for almost 1,000 years, even after it lost Egypt. Their prosperity was based on a very extensive trade network throughout the area. The Kushites also created the Meroitic script, which is one of the world's first alphabets. And while scholars have learned to read the alphabet, they don't quite understand it, the words of the language. Kush also played a very important role in ancient Africa as a whole. Kushites traded iron goods, cloth, gold, and even slaves with other African people in return for ivory, elephant tusks, and ebony wood. They also traded with the ancient Greeks and Romans. And the Kush figured out how to use irrigation well and were able to grow more and more food. Excuse me, but they still had to trade. So they would grow the food and trade it for things like other foods or clothing items and materials, that sort of thing. All right, that's it for lesson 2.